Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your not-so-daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation about the Lord of the Rings, the Rings of Power. The day is Tuesday, August 13th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. We're back with another solo episode today, as last week we got a press release from Amazon revealing the track listing for Season 2's soundtrack album from Bear McCreary. The album is set to be released on August 23rd, and so with a couple of weeks left, I thought it might be fun to do some speculation about the 25 titles that were revealed on the album, and try to see what we might be able to learn from them. This also has the benefit of allowing me to do a much shorter episode than my recent releases, as I fear that you listeners may grow tired of seeing yet another 3-hour episode in your podcast apps. And for me, well, it allows me to give myself a break before the onslaught of marathon episodes that I'll no doubt be doing alongside Season 2. Despite that, I will actually be covering the final trailer that I hear will be dropping this week. And of course, I'll be bringing back my lovely co-host Anna to discuss every single scene. A small difference is that we'll be doing that discussion as a live stream on the Daily Rings of Power YouTube channel. But fear not, I will be editing together an audio version that will appear in your podcast feeds just like normal. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Today's episode is all about the soundtrack titles, and before we start talking about those, we must, as always, begin today's episode with a reading from the Professor's work. Today, our reading comes from the Silmarillion, Chapter 17 of The Coming of Men into the West. Long Felagund watched them, and love for them stirred in his heart, but he remained hidden in the trees until they had all fallen asleep. Then he went among the sleeping people, and sat beside their dying fire where none kept watch. And he took up a rude harp, which Beor had laid aside, and he played music upon it such as the ears of men had not heard. For they had as yet no teachers in the art, save only the dark elves in the wild lands. Now men awoke, and listened to Felagund as he harped and sang, and each thought that he was in some fair dream, until he saw that his fellows were awake also beside him. But they did not speak or stir while Felagund still played, because of the beauty of the music and the wonder of the song. Wisdom was in the words of the Elven King, and the hearts grew wiser that hearkened to him. For the things of which he sang, of the making of Arda and the bliss of Aman beyond the shadows of the sea, came as clear visions before their eyes. And his elvish speech was interpreted in each mind according to its measure. Now, as promised, we're going to be doing a deep dive on the track titles that have been released for Season 2's main soundtrack album, created by the musical genius that is, of course, Mr. Bear McCreary. Fair warning to any listeners who weren't around before Season 1 and didn't listen to my episodes reacting to that soundtrack, I am an absolute musical novice. I'm pretty tone deaf, and I don't know the first thing about musical theory, so please do not expect any sort of expert analysis now or in the future. But luckily for today's episode, we're largely focusing on the titles themselves, rather than the music, and we're trying to work out what scenes, characters, or thematic beats they might correspond to. So let's get on with that. Starting with some of the key facts about Season 2's soundtrack, there are 25 tracks on this album, compared to 40 on the first season's album. So why the significant difference in the number of tracks between these two albums? Well, mainly this is due to the role the first album played, much like the season it was written for, in that it had to introduce numerous characters and places that would be present throughout the series. These included 9 main character themes for the likes of Galadriel, Elrond, Durin, and Sauron, as well as location themes such as Khazad-dûm, Númenor, and Valinor. When you add in the main title theme by Howard Shore, plus the 2 bonus tracks released as exclusives on Amazon Music, you can see that Season 2's album arrives at a similar size. Beyond the number of tracks, what else is notable is the number of featured artists credited on the album. Season 1's album only saw Fiona Apple credited on Where the Shadows Lie, along with Megan Richards and Sophia Nomvetti featuring on This Wandering Day and A Plea to the Rocks. In contrast, Season 2 had 9 featured artists across the 25 tracks. This includes cast members Benjamin Walker, Daniel Wayman, and Rory Kinnear as new entrants, while Sophia Nomvetti is once again lending her voice to yet another Dwarven track. On the non-cast features, we see Raya Yarborough, whose voice did actually appear on some of Season 1's soundtrack, but was not credited on the main album, alongside more new entrants, Rufus Wainwright, Clydeen Jackson, Jens Kidman, and the Mystery of the Bulgarian Voices. What are we to make of all these additional features? Well, a couple of things, I think. Firstly, Amazon have clearly given Bear McCreary even more freedom to bring on collaborating artists to build a soundtrack that continues to widen our conception of what Middle-earth sounds like. And secondly, it's also clear that the show is doubling down on its commitment to bring the musical side of Tolkien to the fore of the show. Finally, it is important to remember that this is not the only album we'll be getting for the show. Just like last season, the press release confirmed that we will be getting episodic albums that will release every week alongside the episodes. That means we'll have dozens more tracks to enjoy in the future, and importantly, it means that if you think there are some glaring omissions, perhaps of your favourite character from this album, they will likely be coming in those weekly releases. But let's not delay any longer, and instead dive right into our first track. Track number 1, Old Tom Bombadil, featuring Rufus Wainwright. Well, they would start the album with this track, wouldn't they? Just to spite me personally, I think. Just a nice little reminder that my arch nemesis is not only appearing in Season 2, but he's getting his own theme, and a piece sung by none other than the legendary Rufus Wainwright. The worst part of all of this is that it is almost certainly going to be an excellent track, and with Wainwright's vocals accompanying Bear's music, it would almost be more of a shock if I didn't love it. I do expect this track to be one of those that plays over the credits. As you will see later in the album, we get a reprise of this track, but one that is actually sung by the actors. This is a repeat of what we saw in Season 1, with This Wandering Day having a version performed by Janet Roddick, in addition to the one we hear in the episode, sung by Megan Richards. Anyway, now we've got that out of the way, we can move on to the tracks that I am excited for. Track number 2, Rhûn, featuring The Mystery of the Bulgarian Voices. This is most likely going to be our only true brand new location theme for Season 2, with sort of the exception of track 8 that we'll be discussing later. And this is actually one of the few tracks that we get some contextual information around. As mentioned in the title, this track features the Mystery of the Bulgarian Voices, who are a female vocal choir first created in the 1950s, who have since performed over 1,250 concerts around the world. An interesting fact for any of my fellow 90s kids listening is that this choir's music was incorporated into the theme music for Xena, Warrior Princess. So whilst they are nearly 3 decades apart, we find this Bulgarian choir with a thread across fantasy television series. In addition to the choir itself, the press release revealed that Bear has also incorporated the gadulka, which is a traditional Bulgarian bowed string instrument. Whilst admittedly I wasn't familiar with this at the time of the release, I've watched several videos of it being played, and it really does produce an interesting mix of sounds. One thing I'm very curious about in this choice of vocals and instruments is whether it was Bear's own unique choice to incorporate this Bulgarian influence for Rhûn, or whether something in the show's pre-existing production of this storyline had led him down this path. Hopefully, one day, I'll get a chance to ask him that very question. Moving on to track number 3, Life in the Canyon. Now with this track, we are staying in Rhûn, but having seen that shot in the San Diego Comic-Con trailer, where Bombadil and the Stranger overlook a valley of desiccated trees, I had initially assumed this is what the title was referring to. However, in the Entertainment Weekly feature released last week, we found out what this title refers to is something far less barren and more full of life. In that article, it was revealed that Nori and Poppy will come across a community of stores living in Rhûn, who have settled in a canyon that allows them to survive in the harsh landscape. This includes 2 of our new cast members, Gavi Singh Chera and Tanya Moody, who play the stores Merrimack and Gundabel respectively. With all that in mind, I think we can probably expect a track very similar in tone to Harfoot Life from the Season 1 album. I'm sure the instrumentation and melodies will be different, but I would be shocked if we didn't get a somewhat jaunty and whimsical track for this other community of proto-hobbits. Moving from Rhûn to Lindon, track number 4, Golden Leaves, featuring Benjamin Walker. Even though I didn't know it was going to be on the album, this track was my most anticipated one. The reason for that is of course because at the Comic-Con panel we saw Benjamin Walker, who plays Gil-galad, stand up and sing an Elvish song for the crowd in attendance. And now we have its title, Golden Leaves. For those of you who have listened to my trailer breakdown with Anna, you will know that I was hoping that this song would be sung as a lament for all the elves who died, or should I say, will die, at the Siege of Eregion. However, with this title and what we've seen from the trailer, it looks like this track will instead coincide with the first wearing of the 3 elven rings, as we see the great tree in Lindon healed, and the golden leaves come forth once more. Whether that's the only place we'll hear this track, I'm not sure, but I for one hope this is not the last time we'll hear Benjamin's Gil-galad sing in the show. Because boy, does he have a lovely voice. Staying with the elves, we have track number 5, Cirdan's Perfection. Well, what can I say about this track? Bear isn't wrong. Cirdan really is perfect in every single way, and I am so delighted that he will be getting a dedicated theme of the same stature that we received for Galadriel and Elrond in Season 1. Now, as for what the perfection in the title actually refers to, I wonder if this is somehow a reference to how Cirdan sees beauty in the elven world. Whether it is in the water and the sea itself, or in the crafting of elegant elven ships to carry his people westward, I think this title is already setting the scene for how his character will be portrayed. In contrast to the stern Gil-galad, the incredibly driven Galadriel, or the somewhat lost Elrond, Cirdan will be shown to possess great wisdom and perhaps someone who has achieved an almost inner peace at his place in Middle-earth. One of the only shots we've seen involving this character in the trailers so far is of him sitting by a rock pool with Elrond and dipping his hand in the water. Perhaps the perfection that is referenced here will be about the contentment that Cirdan has found despite his longing to go west. Whatever this perfection is in reference to, and maybe it's just the elf himself, this is one of the tracks that I am most eager to listen to. Heading over to Khazad-dûm, track number 6, Stone Singers, featuring Sophia Nomvetti. In Season 1, of course, we had a plea to the rocks. In Season 2, it's the Stone Singers. Now, Sophia Nomvetti herself had already promised us that we would see more of Disa and her fellow dwarves' ability to resonate with the rock of the mountain, as was described in the 2nd episode of Season 1. Now, we've also heard from Sophia that Disa will at some point lose her connection to the mountain, and I do wonder whether that will affect the tone of this track to be somewhat unsettled and disjointed. Or perhaps this track will be used for when Disa rediscovers that connection, and she, along with the other singers, will resonate with the mountain once more, signifying the prosperous path that the dwarves might find themselves on once they have possession of the 7 rings. Back over in the desert, we have track 7, Sandstorm at the Well. Definitely one of our more straightforward track titles on the album, and one we don't need to speculate too much about, because it no doubt relates to the scene we've seen across both the main trailers of the Stranger, Nori, and Poppy engulfed by a whirling tornado of sand in Rhûn. I suspect the sandstorm is of the Stranger's conjuring, but to what end? Are they being attacked by the masked figures we saw in the last trailer? Or something even more dangerous that requires a response of Twister-like proportion? As for the music itself, I hope we'll hear some of the similar grandeur that we were treated to in The Wise One from last season's finale. The Wise One remains one of my favourite tracks across the whole season, and I can't wait to see how Bear builds on it in Season 2. On to track 8, Eregion. Eregion, my beloved. It is overdue for the city of our favourite smith to receive its own location theme, beyond the few cursory notes we had in its introduction in episode 2. With so much of the main Celebrimbor and Anatar story taking place in the city this season, it should be no surprise that this is one of the tracks featured on the album. Now, this is also one of the tracks that we received some additional context about in the press release, with it being revealed that Bear incorporated the vocals from a children's choir into the track. I have to say, I love this idea of using the voices of children as a representation for the pastoral innocence and beauty of Eregion, not only because it should be a city that feels unique and special in its own right, but even more so because it will contrast with where we know this story will be going by the end of the season. Once the album releases, I may just listen to this particular track on repeat in order to live in denial of what is to come for the beautiful domain of the Elven Smiths. Staying right where we are is track 9, Emissary at the Forge. Who could this emissary be, I wonder? At a forge of all places? This is a mystery I fear we will not solve before seeing the show. Okay, I apologise for that terrible attempt at a joke, and let us just bask in the glory that is knowing we will soon be hearing a theme that Bear has specifically created just for the Lord of Gifts, Anatar. I imagine we all expect that this will be some delightfully clever play on the Sauron theme created for Season 1, in the same way that Halbrand's theme contained musical clues to his true identity before we'd even seen a single episode. Now, my best guess is that this theme will incorporate elements of that original Halbrand theme, parts of the Valinor theme, representing Anatar's visage as a servant of the Valar, as well as some subtly creepy references to his true identity. Perhaps our best place to look is in Season 1's Sauron theme itself, which if you listen to from the 1 minute 18 mark, you will remember contains an almost angelic quality which nods to Sauron's nature as one of the Maiar. Whereas in that track, the lighter and more beautiful permutations only last for around 20 seconds, I wonder if Emissary at the Forge will be the reverse, with the majority of the track having an ethereal, angelic and serene quality, but with moments of darkness coming to the surface to shake the listener's faith in this beautiful emissary from the moment we see him walk from the flames. And now it's creepy crawly time with track 10, Shelob. To any listeners with arachnophobia, it may just be best to avoid listening to this track, as it will only make you think of the many-legged monster we will be seeing in just a few weeks. As we know from Comic-Con, Isildur is going to have a dangerous encounter with Shelob in the opening of Season 2, and I have no doubt that Bear has cooked up some suitably horror-infused music. As for what it will sound like, I really have no idea. I imagine we might hear some unsettling strings, some light percussion that creates that eerie impression of scuttling legs, and overall creating what will most likely be a teeth-chattering listen. Perhaps this is not a track to include on your future Rings of Power playlist, those songs that you have for when you need some relaxing accompaniment while studying or working. On to track 11, The Pyre, featuring Raya Yarbra. As I mentioned earlier, Raya Yarbra will actually be a familiar voice for listeners, as her beautiful tones appears on a number of the Season 1 tracks found in the episodic albums. She provided the solo vocals for Galadriel's theme in the White Leaves track on Episode 4. In Episode 6, she provides the vocals for the Sindarin lyrics on both In Defiance of Death and The Siege in the Southlands. In Episode 7, she once again provides vocals for the Quenya lyrics on the track Infirmary. So as you can see, in addition to being a long-time collaborator of Bear McCreary, Yarbra is actually someone who you are already acquainted with, even if you didn't realise it. And more importantly, it is no surprise that she is returning for this particular track, when you consider the news we have had that Bronwyn's actor Nazanin Boniardi will not be returning for Season 2. Combining that news with the footage of Arondir lighting a pyre in the first behind-the-scenes video, I think it's clear Bear has once again enlisted Araya's voice to provide that connection between the Arondir and Bronwyn scenes in Season 1 with, well, this unexpectedly sad ending. Perhaps this track will go a step further, and even contain some of the melodies and motifs that we heard on In Defiance of Death in Season 1. Staying in the Southlands, we go to track 12, Estrid. I have to say, this track's title was initially a surprise to me, but in hindsight it seems like an obvious choice. At first I thought it was peculiar for such a new supporting character to have their theme featured on the main album, but once I stopped to think about the important role she is likely to have in Isildur's story both this season and in the seasons to come, it is quite obvious. The most interesting question I will be bearing in mind when listening to this track for the first time is whether the track mainly incorporates elements of the Numenor theme or the Southlands theme. A nod in either direction could give us a clue to Estrid's backstory and heritage, or if it develops throughout the track into the Elendil and Isildur theme, which represents the faithful of Numenor, then we may be getting a very clear signal of her and Isildur's intense connection. However, the speculation on this is likely mute, as the one other note we get from the press release about this track is that it incorporates a Hardanger fiddle. According to Bear's blog on Season 1, Episode 1, this is the same instrument that was one of many used in Bear's composition of the Southlands theme. So, whilst that isn't a definite answer to Estrid's identity, I think we can take it as a pretty big clue. Heading over to Numenor for the first time, we have track 13, The Great Eagle. What am I even meant to say about this one? Eagles are already cool, and giant eagles just up the cool factor exponentially if you ask me. Obviously, we've already seen a number of shots of the Great Eagle flying into land on the edge of the Númenórean court, with Pharazôn striding forward to face the eagle and drawing his sword. As for what kind of music we might expect from this track, I wouldn't be surprised if it was a combination of the Númenor and Valinor themes. The former obviously representing the location and grandeur of Númenor's royal court, with the Valinor theme being interwoven as a way of signifying the Great Eagle's role as servants of Manwë, king of the Valar. On to track 14, The River Daughter, featuring Raya Yarbrough. As we covered on track 11, this marks yet another return for Yarbrough to the soundtrack, this time on a song whose title immediately had people excited for the possibility of Tom Bombadil's wife, Goldberry, making an appearance. Now I'm still very much on the fence over whether we'll actually see the River Daughter herself or not, but I do think the inclusion of Yarbrough rather than one of the cast suggests that this isn't a track sung by one of the characters, and therefore I have to sadly say that it is less likely that this is a song performed by Goldberry herself. Could it instead be that at some point Bombadil talks to the stranger about how he has left Goldberry in the Old Forest to come on his journey to Rhûn, and the music will instead signify his love for her and how much he misses her whilst being away? Alternatively, I have seen other members of the community speculate that the track's title is actually a clever piece of misdirection, and instead is going to be a reference to another character, perhaps Poppy. The only other speculation I have at this point is that while all of Yarbrough's appearances on the Season 1 soundtrack involved her singing lyrics in Elvish, given the title of this track, I would be quite surprised if that is still the case here. We're heading back to spooky season with track 15, Barrow-wights. Is there anything creepier in the world than undead monsters coming out of the mist while singing at you? Well, except maybe Tom Bombadil doing the same thing, but I digress. In the press release, it talks about Bear utilising deathly whispers for the terrifying Barrow-wights, and in the Empire magazine feature we covered previously on the podcast, it was suggested that we will hear the Wights singing a version of Cold Be Hand and Heart and Bone. Now, whatever this track ends up sounding like, I have a bad feeling this won't be one I'm able to listen to late at night. Unless that is, I constantly want to be looking over my shoulder for pale blue eyes gleaming in the darkness. Going from the monstrous to the wondrous, we have track 16, Forgiveness Takes an Age. I am sure that forgiveness does take an age for those characters who we most commonly associate with the phrase, "don't be hasty." From the last trailer, we of course know that this track is in reference to the Ents and Entwives that Arondir and co will be encountering on their journey to or from Pelargir. I have to admit that I am absolutely fascinated by the possibilities that Bear could incorporate on a musical theme for the Ents. Or perhaps this track's musical cues will owe less to our new Entish friends and instead to fallen characters. After all, Anna and I theorised that the line this track title is taken from may be spoken to Arondir as a way to help him deal with the grief over the suspected loss of Bronwyn. Could we see Bear bringing back the Bronwyn and Arondir theme one more time? but interlaced with an even more somber tone of loss and grief. I guess we'll have to wait to find out. But this is a track that I would say you could put good money as being on the list of suspected tearjerkers from this album. Speaking of tearjerkers, track 17, Candles on the Tide, featuring Clydeen Jackson. There's really nothing quite like an allusion to candles being floated out on the tide to make you think of loss and mourning. I'm sure that, like myself, your first thought upon seeing this title was that it would be tied to Numenor and a loss associated with that storyline. Now, will this be some kind of ceremony to mourn the recently departed king, Tar Palantir, with Miriel leading her people in an offering of light to the sea as her father's spirit departs beyond the walls of the world, her own eyes unable to see the light which she offers to the Valar? Or will this be a similar ceremony where Numenor's citizens, those whose kin died in the expedition to Middle-earth, release these candles as a way of remembering their fallen sons and daughters? I am open to either possibilities or something else entirely, but one thing I'm certain of is that this music will accompany a beautifully sad scene. Perhaps other listeners will have also, like me, thought of the scene from Thor: The Dark World, where the people of Asgard perform a similar ceremony. If you want to listen to some beautiful music that accompanied this very scene, listen to one of my favourite tracks, Into Eternity, by Brian Tyler. Now, as for Clydeen Jackson's role in this track, I must admit that her name did not immediately ring a bell for me, but as I've discovered, this is clearly down to my own ignorance. Jackson has appeared on recordings from legendary artists, including Rod Stewart, Barbra Streisand, Michael McDonald, and Patti LaBelle. Her debut album was produced by Ray Charles, and she has a long history of appearing in television and film soundtracks, having featured on the likes of Hidden Figures, Avatar, The Lion King, and Creed II. Suffice to say, whilst I might not have been familiar with Jackson before this release, I cannot wait to hear what she brings to what is sure to be an emotional piece of music. On to track 18, Army of Orcs. We've had one theme for the Orcs, yes, but what about a second theme? Clearly, Bear wasn't satisfied with just giving us a chest-thumping track in Nampat for Season 1. Now we'll be getting something even bigger as Adar's army of children has grown and looks set on waging terrible war in Season 2. I don't have much to add in terms of speculation for this track, as I expect it to be an expanded play on the elements we've already heard in Nampat. Although, given that this track is focused on the idea of an army and the footage we've seen in the trailers, I wonder if this new track will incorporate more warlike elements, such as the beat of a war drum to signify those hordes being on the march. Now listener, here is future Harry coming back to correct past Harry, as in a brief exchange on Twitter today, Bear McCreary confirmed to me that the war drums seen in the last promo do appear on this track. So, at least one out of the dozens of speculations I've made in this episode is in fact correct. Gift of foresight confirmed? No, still probably not. Staying with this army, we get to track 19, The Last Ballad of Damrod, featuring Jens Kidman. Now this track, I don't actually need to speculate about, because on Thursday, August 8th, The Last Ballad of Damrod was released as the first preview track from the album. I'm not sure what people expected, but it was an absolute head-banging, skull-crushing, and ear-pounding heavy metal powerhouse of a song. Jens Kidman's vocals lend an intense and captivating quality to this song, even for someone like me, who isn't usually found listening to this genre of music. The fandom then spent the morning speculating about the lyrics, including a very poor attempt from yours truly to try and transcribe the words, only for Bear very kindly to drop the official lyric video later that same day. I'll link the video and lyrics in the show notes, but fans of Tolkien will quickly recognise that many of the lines in the song draw their inspiration from Sam's poem about the stone troll in Fellowship of the Ring. I expect the version of Damrod's last ballad that we hear in the episode itself may come without the lyrics, and instead be an instrumental version that will play alongside scenes of this troll wreaking havoc on the battlefield. But for those of you metal fans, you can now count down the days until the full album releases by just playing this song on repeat after repeat. Speaking of battlefields, we go to track 20, Battle for Eregion. This track obviously needs little speculation or suggestions for what it might entail, as I think we can all agree we are in for something quite special here for the eponymous 2-episode battle. However, when the album does release, I'll be interested to hear whether this track on the main album is solely focused around Adar and the Orcs from a thematic perspective, or whether we'll hear themes from characters like Elrond, Celebrimbor, Sauron and Gil-galad all make their way into this track's musical construction. I don't think there's much point in adding additional speculation here, but I will say that obviously I cannot wait for this track as we wait to see this battle on screen in little over a month's time. And now we have track 21, Durin's Bane. When I was writing my notes for this one, I simply began with deep, exasperated sigh. Long-time listeners will know my feelings about the inclusion of the Balrog in Khazad-dûm's Second Age story, and I will not bore you with repeating myself about the problems I have with it. Regardless, I'm actually not going to spend any time on this track, except to say, yeah, I'm sure the music will be cool. I just wish it wasn't for this demon of shadow and flame. Who should be sleeping, by the way. Okay, alright, I'm moving on, I promise. I'm moving on. Track 22, Last Temptation, Manipulation, Seduction, Temptation. I wonder who this could be referring to. Of course, the real question is not who is doing the tempting, as it must be in reference to the great deceiver Sauron himself, but rather who is he offering this temptation to? And even more curious is the fact that this is referred to as a last temptation, suggesting the subject is being offered one last gift or offer. My instinct is to say that this will be Sauron's final attempt to get Celebrimbor to deliver the remaining rings of power to him, or perhaps even to get Celebrimbor to abandon the other elves and follow him under his new dark dominion. However, I know that following the scenes we saw in Season 1, there will be those who think that this final temptation could represent Sauron making one last overture to Galadriel to join him in his rule of Middle-earth. Whichever character is being tempted, I am sure once we hear the music with the album's release, we may get a big clue to that answer. But if you want my bet, I'm still putting my money on Celebrimbor. Back over in the world of all things mystical, we have track 23, The Staff. A wizard this way comes, methinks. Or perhaps more than one wizard based on some of the scenes we've seen in the promo up till now. I was not especially surprised to see a track that most likely relates to the Stranger appearing towards the end of the album, as while the main focus of Season 2's story will be around Sauron and his work in Eregion, the Rhûn plotline will still need to deliver a satisfying payoff. If Season 1 ended with the Stranger finding his voice, and with it some control over his inherent power, it would be fitting if Season 2 ended with him gaining even more control over his power through the acquisition of a staff befitting an Istar. Of course, we saw the Stranger briefly take hold of the Mystic Staff in last season's finale, before it seemed to disintegrate along with its previous owners. I think Season 2 will see the Stranger receive, or perhaps retrieve, a staff that he will carry throughout the rest of the show. As the showrunners have repeated the point that the Stranger's story is less about his identity than it is about his journey, I think our mystery wizard gaining his staff before the next step of his journey would be a fitting endpoint for Season 2. On to our penultimate entry on the album, we have track 24, Old Tom Bombadil Reprise, featuring Rory Kinnear and Daniel Wayman. We can only assume that this is the track which, as we heard in interviews, will accompany a scene of Tom and the Stranger singing and sparring. I'm sure all the Bombadil fans are eagerly anticipating seeing this, and for that I suppose I wish you well. Despite my own individual distaste for the yellow-booted fiend, I do actually like that we will be having scenes like this in the season. With the showrunners and cast constantly talking about the darker tone of this season, and with all the harrowing scenes we're set to endure, it will be important to have moments of light and levity amidst all that grim darkness. So, it seems I might actually be endorsing a scene of Tom Bombadil singing. Look how far the mighty have fallen, listeners. Oh dear. And finally, we have track 25. The Sun Yet Shines. Now, it might be the last, but this is the most fascinating track title for me by far. The reason I say this is because I think it gives us our biggest clue about how Season 2 will end, both plot-wise and thematically. Before I explain that idea, I should say that we have heard a version of the line, "The sun yet shines," in the last trailer. It was one of the last voiceovers we heard in the Comic-Con trailer, when a male voice says, "When the darkness falls, there are always some who rise forth and shine." Now, I thought this line was said by Eregion, but I've seen other people online suggest it doesn't sound like him, and is in fact spoken by Cirdan, so I guess we'll have to wait and see who the mystery speaker is. Nonetheless, let me return to why I think this being the final track on the album is so significant. To put it simply, what is more Tolkienian than the idea of the shadow being a passing thing, and of hope always persevering beyond any darkness? The idea that a light will once again shine and a better day will come. If Season 2 truly lives up to all this talk of being a season full of darkness and despair, then the most important task the showrunners will have set themselves is to not end the season on a despairing note. Tolkien's work is not, and has never been, nihilistic or grimdark in its disposition, and it is crucial that we do not find ourselves sitting, staring at the TV screen as the credits for Episode 8 roll, and find ourselves in such a pit of despair. There must be hope and light on the horizon, even if for many of our characters it is just that, a glint of a reprieve in the distance. This all leads me to believe that this track may play over one of the final scenes in Season 2. Perhaps it is even a montage that cuts between all the different plot lines we have been following, and in each one we will see that our protagonists still have a reason to hope, no matter how meagre that hope is. For Elrond and Galadriel, it may be a nod towards their future roles as lords of their own kingdoms. For Elendil and Miriel, it may be a sign that the faithful remain strong in Númenor, and for Durin and Disa, it may be the vision of a better way forward for Khazad-dûm. Now, of course, I could be totally wrong, and this track will just represent an accompaniment for one specific scene focused on one specific character. But listeners, to keep myself positive and optimistic, until I see it, I will choose to believe that Season 2 will end with our characters looking up towards the light, and not wallowing in darkness. And with that, we've reached the end of this quite lengthy speculation on the titles for Season 2's soundtrack album. As I said at the top of the show, with episodic albums to come during the show's weekly release schedule, don't be worried if your favourite character hasn't yet made an appearance among these 25 tracks. Just like we did for Season 1, we'll no doubt be back following the release of this album on the 23rd with an episode or two providing you my reaction to, and my layman's analysis of, the music we hear. If you'd like to turn back time and listen to my reaction to Season 1's soundtrack album whilst you wait, go check out episodes 15 and 16. If you're somehow new to this podcast, make sure you subscribe on whichever podcast platform you prefer, so that you never miss an episode. And now that the Daily Rings of Power podcast is on YouTube, I'd greatly appreciate if you could head on over there and hit subscribe. As I said, we should be hosting our very first live stream later this week, with Anna and I discussing the final trailer that is set to be released very, very soon. So head on over to Daily Rings of Power on YouTube, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so that you'll see when we're live. As always, I'd love to continue the conversation on Twitter or in the comments on YouTube. Let me know if you have any theories for these tracks, or if there are other themes that you expect to see on the episodic albums. But for today, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back very soon with another episode of the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.